Welcome to the podcast about venture capital, where investors and founders alike can learn how VCs make decisions and reach conviction. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Tsune Shirota joins us today from Palo Alto. He is partner at the World Innovation Lab. WIL has invested in companies including Wise, Auth0, Asana, Algolia, and Mural. Prior to joining WIL, Tsune was VP of Business Operations and Strategy at Evernote. Tsune, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I gave you a quick intro there. Can you give us more of your backstory, 3 minutes on your path to venture?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, let me start from the very beginning, right? I was born to a family of medical professionals in Japan. Everyone in my family was either a doctor, dentist, or a life science researcher. But growing up, I was more interested in the business and economy, how companies work, and why is this country more developed than that country, and that kind of topics. And also, this is not always productive, but when everyone around me thinks something is great and following a path, like I kind of naturally become skeptical. So when I saw my brother and cousins follow the family tradition and pursue a career in medical, I thought maybe there's something else, or actually there should be something at least really interesting outside of that path. So anyway, I decided to deviate from the family tradition when I was relatively young. And then I majored in economics and finance and started my career in investment banking in Tokyo. And after a few years, I came to Stanford for an MBA. That was 2010. And ever since, I'm based in the Bay Area. And my original plan was to pursue investing career right after MBA. So I got an offer to join a large investment firm as an investor post-graduation. But through my time at Stanford, I became really interested in entrepreneurship and venture. So on one hand, I actually spent a good amount of time working for an investment firm while at Stanford and doing investment research and learning investment processes, which was a lot of fun. But I started feeling that I'd like to see and work inside a high growth company. And I was feeling that experience might actually help me become a good investor in the long run because, I thought I would understand the subject better, right? So, long story short, I ended up declining an offer to become a public equity investor and joined a company with 60, 70 employees. And that company was already funded by Sequoia and Morgan Taylor and was finalizing a financing with Meritech and T. Rowe Price when I was interviewing with them. And that company was Evernote.
Wow. Only 60 to 70 when you joined.
Yeah. So we were in a small office in Mountain View, and there are only, I think, 1 or 2 bathrooms. And when I went there for interview, there's always a line. And the company moved to a bigger office in Redwood City right around the time when I joined. So,
at least it wasn't a garage.
It was not in a garage, that's for sure. Yeah. So I was hired by Phil Libin, the co-founder and CEO of Evernote, as his chief of staff. Basically, I was a generalist, working on a wide range of topics from, it's really wide, HR systems to customer support, to marketing campaigns. But, given my background in finance and investment and banking and that kind of stuff, my focus shifted to analytics entirely. And eventually I became VP of Analytics and Biz Ops. So my team and I worked with product, engineering, and marketing to think about where are we getting customers from and how are they retained and what's the behavior of those users, engagement and monetization and so on. Yeah, that was a good experience. Good learning, gave me perspectives into a lot of key aspects of internet software businesses, right? The product model, distribution model, the product engagement, monetization, and that kind of stuff, but also, more broadly, entrepreneurship and venture, organizational behavior, culture, leadership, and so on. So I was there for 4 years in total. And then I joined Will. So we go by Will as a partner. And that was 2016. And since then I've been here for the last 5 years and very fortunate to have invested in and worked with companies like, like you mentioned, Auth0, Asana, Wise, Mural, Algolia, and so on.
Very good. So tell us, what is Will?
Yeah, Will is a Japan investing entity, but it has a few aspects in it. So let me talk about that. The first, again, it's a financially driven investment firm. We manage about $1 billion of capital and invest in technology companies globally. And we also invest in venture funds too. We can talk more about that. But another aspect besides the investment of Will is that we provide consultative engagements, consulting services for the LPs of the fund. So we are backed by roughly 30 corporates and Japan government. So corporates in Japan like Sony, Nissan, car company, Suzuki, airlines, banks, insurance companies, and so on and so forth. And so the vision of the founder of the firm, Gen Sayama, is that, serving those large corporates is a critical part of this organization. So we have somewhat unique setup like that. So our LPs get financial returns by investing in our fund, but also they work with a subset of our team on many projects. And we jointly create new products and sometimes launch JVs, the new businesses together. And we run educational programs for the LPs, employees on technology trends and launching new products, designing products, so different topics. But yeah, so those different capabilities combined in one entity, that's Will.
Got it. And how is the capital split up? It sounds like you do some of your own LP investing and allocate to funds. You also allocate to startups. Maybe break it down for us at that parent level, and then also sort of the stage that you invest in check sizes when you're investing direct.
Yeah. So most of the capital is dedicated for the direct investments in startups. And we have a dedicated vehicle for fund investments. It's a new initiative. We didn't disclose the size of that effort yet, but we are actively investing in venture funds, emerging ones, and established ones. And for the direct investment side, we have, in terms of the office location, we have Tokyo and Palo Alto, 2 locations. And the team in Tokyo primarily looks into the opportunities in Japan. And that effort is basically all in every stage. I'm happy to dive into the state of that venture market there. But, the size is relatively small compared to the US and elsewhere. So they look at everything and anything. And Palo Alto location, where I belong to, we look at mid to late stage investments, typically 10 to 30 million investments per company, series B, C, D, sometimes E. So those mid to late stage rounds, and primarily software and fintech.
And these will be tech companies based in the United States?
Yeah.
Yes.
So US, and we don't care that much about the headquarter location these days, but mostly United States and some in Europe.
Okay.
So one of the most recent investments I led for the firm is Ivan, which is an infrastructure company headquartered in Helsinki. So our mandate is pretty global.
Very good. Very good. And are you a generalist? Do you invest across sectors, or are there certain themes or focus areas?
Yeah, I have focused on 3 areas. And one is let's say, so 80% software and 20% more consumer-oriented internet services. And within that 80% split into half. One is developer-oriented software like Auth0, Algolia, Ivan, Kong. And the other half is collaboration productivity software like Asana and Mural. And the 20% more of the consumer-oriented services, TransferWise, Wise is one good example. So those are the 3 areas I have focused on so far.
Cool. And then if we could briefly touch on the LP side. So what is the mandate when deploying into venture funds? You mentioned that you'll invest in emerging funds. Are those types of funds that have certain geographic thesis or sector technology-based theses? What is the focus on the LP side?
Yeah. So again, we have a dedicated effort there. And the high-level theme or idea is to create something complementary to our direct investment efforts. And sometimes it means that different geography. So we invested in funds in Asia. Again, our direct investment efforts outside Japan tend to focus on the US and Europe. So the investing in funds in Asia kind of makes sense to cover the cast wide net. And for the funds in the US and elsewhere, we tend to, so far, invested in early stage funds that take care of the investments that we don't normally do, so that we can have a broader coverage, if you will. But we're not limited to just those early stage funds either. So we actually invested in growth stage funds too. So trying to cover wide areas through the capital from Japan.
Very good. And tell us more about the interest of the corporates in Japan, to invest in the fund. Are you launching, as these tech companies get to growth stage, are you launching in Japan, and, are they helping and benefiting from that? Or, what's the motivating factor for the corporate involvement?
Yeah. So, there's several aspects, but one is just pure financial returns from investing in our fund. That's pretty straightforward, but that's not the only motivation, obviously. And for strategic angles, there are a couple areas. One is to have exposure to the companies that we invest in, and they are always looking for new technologies that they can use, right? And whether that technology comes from Japanese companies or companies outside Japan, if it fits with their strategic agenda, that's very good, right? And we serve as the sort of the research hub in certain areas for them. And we have regular dialogues about what could make sense for them to look into. And we try to have that conversation and insights from those conversations in our investment research too. So that serving as a research hub for them is a big aspect. And I briefly mentioned, launching joint ventures and new products with them. So that's one motivation too. So we deploy certain part of our capital that we raise from the LPs into those efforts. So we launched the smart lock company in Japan, for example, that was back in 2015. And that was a joint venture with Sony. So if there's an opportunity where we can leverage the technologies and brands that these corporates have, and they're interested in creating new businesses out of it with us, we pursue those opportunities too. And they're interested in building those new initiatives with us too.
Is Japan a market that most tech companies should be thinking about, and why and when is the right time for expansion? We've had some discussions on this show about expansion into Europe and sort of from a commercial standpoint, the percentage of revenues that should be coming from Europe at the time of IPO. Give us the case for Japan, if there is a case, and when the right time is for expansion.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me start from the market of Japan, right, for high growth technology companies. Japan is the second largest country in IT spending, just by country. If you add up software, data center, IT services spending, the annual spending in Japan is roughly 150 billion or so, 150, 160. And that's about 20% of North America. And of that 150 billion, it's actually a service-heavy market. So 75% of that is IT services. And that 75% is much higher than North America, where I think 50, 60% is IT service. What does it mean, right? So it's a sizable market in terms of the spending, but the transition from manual kind of services to software is ongoing, and it's still early stage. And I envision that the spending would surely convert to more services, software over the coming years, which will create a lot of opportunities for B2B companies, for example. And technology change happens at a different rate, right, at different country. But there are secular changes, like, on the B2C side, the transition to e-commerce is a real secular trend that happens everywhere in the world. Marketplace, video-based communication, and enterprise side, cloud, transition to services, from service to software, API-driven software. And those transitions will happen. It's just that the timing is an interesting consideration. And the question is, who's going to take this market, right? And we are talking about billions of dollars of annual spending, transitioning from manual services to software over the coming years. And even today, right, companies like Slack and GitHub publicly announced at one point that Japan was their second largest country after the US. And large tech companies like Microsoft, Amazon, AWS, Google, Apple, Facebook, all of them have really big business in Japan. Salesforce has $1.2 billion ARR just in Japan, which is, pretty meaningful business. So I think, if you're building a big, large business, you will likely go there at some point. But the question is, when, right? To
The
your
question
point.
is when, right?
Yeah. So that's a pretty nuanced and important question. And generally speaking, I think the company feels ready to take on new initiatives like going to Japan or anywhere, right? New geographies or new initiatives when they comfortably say yes to three questions. So that's my perspective. So one is there a good market opportunity? I mean, do they understand the opportunity in the first place? And two, do they have ideas on the size and scope of the investment, right? So what does it take? And then finally, is the return profile interesting enough compared to other growth opportunities? So like if, the company comfortably says, okay, yes, to all of those three, I think the company is ready to go in. And unless that happens, regardless of the opportunity or what, I think the entry doesn't happen. And the timing when a company gains confidence in saying yes to all those three, I think depends in large part of the business model, right? So for some business models, it totally makes sense to delay that timing. But for others, it makes sense to go earlier. And so let me give you a few examples, starting with B2C model, right? So DoorDash just had a press conference in Japan yesterday, saying that they would go there. And they're now aggressively hiring in Japan, like tens of people. And they have the net revenue of 4 billion and $50 billion market cap, I think. And they take 56% market share in the US, right? So, I mean, they built a really, really big business in the US. And I think they have Canada. But the point is, they built a really huge business. And then they finally go to Japan. I think it's their third or maybe fourth country after US and Canada. And to me, that makes sense, right? Because it's a local network business and invest a lot locally and dominate the local market and go one by one. And you evaluate the different markets that you want to go next internationally. And if the company says yes to those three questions that I laid out, they would go. But the timing is after they reach $50 billion market cap, but still makes sense to me. Whereas, there are other types of B2C businesses where it makes sense to go a lot earlier, right? So an example is Clubhouse, for example. It's a new social platform where creators generate voice-based contents, right? And the weekly active users for Clubhouse, I think, was the highest in Japan, even higher than the US. When I looked at the data from, I think, App Annie a couple months ago. Oh, interesting. So Japan is the biggest country for them, at least when I looked at the data. And I joined a town hall meeting held by the Clubhouse team for the Japanese users. And the enthusiasm there was crazy. The people are sharing really passionately about the stories of connecting with their communities and fan base and all that. And that's great, right? And people just came. In the Clubhouse, I don't think they did push marketing or anything. And if that happens, I mean, why not hiring a local community manager there? And why not hiring a support person there? I think it makes sense for them to make investment in Japan to get that community going, right? Which is a stark contrast versus DoorDash, which reached 4 billion or $50 billion market cap. And then, okay, we're going to go and invest a lot versus Clubhouse. Just naturally, organically, the user arrived at the platform and used the platform, right? I can just keep going.
DoorDash, one requires more infrastructure, it's more localized, more investment, right? Clubhouse, a bit more horizontal technology that can scale quicker in different geos. I'd be curious to hear your take on consumer behavior in Japan vis-a-vis China, right? Like talking about DoorDash, do the Meituans, are Japanese consumers resistant to Chinese-born companies, or is like a Meituan and other super apps, are they viable entering Japan versus a company like a DoorDash?
Yeah, so for that specific market, there's an incumbent in Japan called Demae-kan, which was majority acquired by Line, which is the WhatsApp in Japan. And Line is trying to create a super app, just like super app in China. Mm-hmm. And that's the play. And so in that market, Demae-kan and Uber Eats is actually doing pretty well. And there's DoorDash that's coming in right now. And Wolt, the Northern European player in food delivery space is coming into Japan market. So it's going to be very interesting. But to your point of the domestic versus international, I think it depends. We'll see what happens in this particular market. But looking at the way how Uber Eats, executing and growing by acquiring a lot of restaurant chains and even the smaller restaurants and building out the infrastructure, I think there's definitely a chance for international players to win. I just don't see Chinese players playing in that market. China, it may come, right? So for example, the e-commerce companies, the Coupon from Korea, I think they're looking into going to the Japan market. That's what's reported. So it's an opportunity again. So it's a sizable market, but the secular change in technology is ongoing. So there's a growth opportunity for many. Some markets are taken by domestic players because of the nature of the market, but oftentimes there are opportunities for international players too.
Yeah, just actually spoke in depth about Coupang with Ben Sun from Primary, that was a seed investor. But again on that question, are there between countries in Asia, are there behavioral sort of resistance at all to companies founded in different Asian countries, or is that not the case? I know here in the States, if a company is founded in Canada, I don't think there's any resistance whatsoever to U.S. customers embracing it if it's the right tech. And I would think it vice versa. If it's the right tech in the U.S., then Canadians would not be resistant. But is that a thing in Asia or not?
It might be. But I think what happens more is, at least until at this point, right? So the players from non-Asian countries did very well in Japan. Not so much from the internet players from China, Korea, other parts of the world did very well in Japan. So we'll see. It may happen, but I think it's still not clear. But speaking of Line, which is a dominant messaging platform, it's a Korean-owned business. Mm-hmm. So and people just love the product. I think there's a product meritocracy in that market. If the product is really designed well and suit the needs of the local people, and then if there's a commitment on the company's side to invest in that market, there's definitely a path to thrive. So that's my view.
Tsune, you've spent a number of years now in the States, growing up in Japan. How do you think the buying behavior or corporate business B2B behaviors are different maybe in Japan than they are in the States, and how does that impact sort of the way that tech companies should approach this new market?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll say two things. One is, Japan is a typical example of the high context culture, right? The communication is more indirect than direct.
Right.
And probably there are times when, people from the Western countries think that, okay, so what happened in that meeting? Right.
I've been there. I used to work for an advanced robotics company, and we had some suppliers and some customers, semiconductor and printed circuit board manufacturing. And we worked with a number in Japan, and it was, often we'd make requests and we would get the answer, yes, absolutely. But there was some reading between the lines that the experienced folks in the business would allude to and stuff. So you can't just always take things at face value. Yeah.
So in that culture, people tend to value FaceTime and seeing how you behave. Again, the communication is not only the words, but also the way how it's delivered and expressed and all that. So speaking of Line, right? Why did that platform do so well in Japan is precisely because they prepared a lot of different options for people to express their emotions through emoji, like a very rich emoji. Emoji, by the way, is a Japanese word. And so expressing themselves in a really subtle way, I think that's the nature of the country and culture. I think that's one thing to probably keep in mind. And so sometimes, it's kind of hard to read. But my recommendation always to just show up and show your face and talk to the people, audience directly, and tell your story, right? Why you are doing what you're doing and why you are interested in doing business in Japan. And they're for sure wondering, if I invest in this technology, is this company going to be around and support me for long term or not? And I mean, who is this? And can I trust this person or company versus the local equivalent? So again, my advice for the founders is to show up. And we traveled Japan with founders of Auth0, Asana, Algolia, Wise, and many others. And, what we did is, again, tell the story, show up as a human instead of transactional executive. And we help translate, right, digitally and culturally. And people come out of the travel oftentimes after the rounds of interactions saying that I actually understood and like this country and market. I feel we can build a good business here with the people there. So I think it requires a little of the face-to-face, more direct interactions and the commitment. But once that's there, I think oftentimes with good intention, there's an opportunity to build a lasting relationship.
Yeah, I think it's probably cliche at this point, but a famous story from Phil Knight and his Shoe Dog book is, his
for sure
exploits in Japan, right? Getting his tiger shoes created and all the relationship building and trust that was required in order to get that done.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Tsune, what's the state of venture capital in Japan? Can you talk about maybe some stats, data, or trends, from a VC standpoint in Japan?
Yeah, so sure. So let me start with the numbers, right? So it's a $5 billion a year market growing at 20% on average for the last 5 years. So that's the size and growth of the market. And let's just compare that against the US, right? US, it's a $166 billion market, but actually 76 billion of that is mega round. The huge rounds that is bigger than 100 million, which doesn't happen, rarely in Japan. So let's just exclude that 76. The most comparable number is 5 billion in Japan versus 90 billion in the US. And that 90 billion is growing at 8% in the US over the last 5 years on average. So that's about 5-6% of the US, if you think about that size. And that's about the size of the Seattle, somewhere between Seattle to New York market of the VC, I think, but growing much faster than the US average over the last 5 years. So that's the sizing and growth perspective. And in terms of the nature of the investments in Japan, right? So historically, startups in Japan historically chose to go public early. And, the VC market was small, so there are not many huge companies in the first place too. But there are not many opportunities other than angel, seed, and Series A, and maybe Series B investors. But that is changing quickly. For example, one of our Series A investments, Smart HR, just raised $150 million from the leading US-based crossover investors like Sequoia Capital, Growth, Global Equities, Light Street, Whale Rock. And they publicly disclosed and reported that they have $40 million in ARR growing at 100% plus in a large market in Japan where they have really strong competitive advantage. So, and some of the most explosive growth companies in Japan are building really impressive business like this, right? Doing 10, 20, 30, 40 million US run rate with strong underlying fundamentals and cost structure with interesting market potential. So, and then the founders of these emerging companies in Japan are hungry for learning about business models and product models of technology companies outside Japan. But there's a language barrier, so they tend to seek counsel in Japanese. And I feel that, I fit with that description pretty nicely. So I increasingly more often meet with high growth companies in Japan these days. And I think it will grow from here to a lot is our expectation.
Is it very Tokyo centric?
Yes, I would say so. There are some companies in other regions. For example, Toyota, large car company, is not in Tokyo, right? And so there are pockets of regions where there's a big company and university, and they produce a lot of interesting ideas and talents, but mostly in Tokyo will be a kind of right oversimplification, I would say.
Got it. Tsune, can you talk a bit about how you shape your views about, global market opportunity for tech companies and products?
Sure. Yeah. I would say, so the first step is kind of really understand customer perspectives from my perspective, right? Again, I do believe that there are universal tech trends like transition to cloud, SaaS, video-based communication, collaboration, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. But the S-curve is different, right? The adoption timing and curve, the shape of that is different depending on the country. So that's just a fundamental belief. But the question is, okay, what's the real secular trend or the theme that I can believe in? And just figuring that out is one part. And the second part is, okay, when we think about helping them go global, especially in Japan, what's the shape of the curve or what's the readiness of the market? So one example is the theme, right? One fundamental belief I have is companies want to build more software, right? But they just can't build as much as they want. I mean, that's a real secular pain or theme that is relevant for any companies in the world. And I mean, at a given time, there are more things they want to build and fix, but engineering resources, they're constrained. So every company needs to find a way to remove that bottleneck, and anything that can provide help in that regard, I think is a great service for any companies in the world. Again, the S-curve shape might be different depending on the region a little bit, so the timing issue stays there, but still, I think that's a global trend. So like, that's the reason why we've invested in API-driven companies like Auth0 and Algolia. I mean, you don't need to build functionality like authentication or search anymore. And just make your software use these functionalities through API, and boom, you can focus on other stuff, right? So which is a big leverage for your business. I mean, same for Stripe, same for Twilio. So we think it's a very important trend, and this opens up a big opportunity for software business. Right? Because now the users of the software is not human. The software you built is the user of these services. So this opens up the big opportunity for just the software industry itself as a whole. And that's precisely the reason why we are super excited with these companies. And that's a real global trend. And then, okay, so the question is, where are we? When we help these companies go into the Japan market, what's the shape of the S-curve and what's the situation? And what we tend to do is to start from the customers, right? Okay, so we think this is the important trend for anyone competing in this world. And is there a customer pool already? And so we have, I don't know, it's a group of 20, 30 CIOs, CTOs, at least I personally keep in touch always in Japan, and they are building really interesting businesses, sometimes large companies, sometimes, startups, and then have regular conversations with them. And what do you think of this emerging product? And do you see yourself using these products? And if so, we create an opportunity for startup and them to meet and then talk about the technology. And we've done a lot of those efforts. So that's roughly the process. Think about a big trend and think about, okay, is this product ready from our perspective for global expansion? I mean, there's some natural organic adoption that happens, right? But in a real kind of mainstream usage, can this go big in Japan market? And fortunately for Auth0, for example, so we partnered in 2018, and Eugenio, the CEO, publicly tweeted about this, but they grew the Japan business 40x over the last 3 years, and the country was ready, and they executed really, really well. And so that's just one example, but that's the process.
Are there specific categories or sectors that lend themselves better to the Japanese market? Like you mentioned before, IT services, huge opportunity. Are there others that are a better natural fit?
Yeah, so there are several aspects in it. One is, what's the distribution model of the product, right? And so there's a need perspective and there's a distribution perspective. Mm-hmm. And just starting from the distribution perspective, and even within just software products, if we oversimplify it, there's top-down sales and bottom-up, more of the product-led growth type. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if it's product-led growth, it's possible that people just pick it up and start using the product, right? So it's easier to have some kind of early traction, which helps companies to answer the 3 questions that I mentioned. Okay, so there's something going on. So if the company has product-led or organic grassroots growth, then I think there's a chance for people in Japan to just naturally pick it up and use. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, I think, is the nature of the product, right? And if the product is, for example, addressing tax compliance in Japanese market. That's very specific, right? And HR law compliance, which by the way is, Smart HR, the company that I just mentioned, is doing pretty well. Those are hard, right? And I think if it goes down to like less specific about the country specific needs, the better. So the infrastructure software, AWS is doing really, really well in Japan. So did Auth0, right? And some of the more horizontal, like a general use case productivity software like Slack, Asana, Notion, those products are doing really, really well too. So I think, whether there is a specific country component, how big is that? I think is one consideration when you think about the nature of the product that could do well or not so much in early stage of the company development.
What's your take on sort of changes in work, remote work with COVID? And you said this line is blurring, we're speaking over Zoom now. What's your take on that? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, right? And I think it will be hybrid. I guess it's not like one or the other. I think it's somewhere in between. And because it would be very hard for anyone to say that, okay, so we have 10-person meeting and everyone needs to be here. And some like 1 or 2 person may need to dial in from somewhere because the people live different places. People are allowed to travel going forward. And, the company tries to have intimate workplace so that people can build on each other's ideas and collaborate better. But my view is that it's going to be very hard to force something. And there needs to be a space where people can actually dial in, even if it's more in person. And then question is what would happen at that point? And the biggest challenge is not so much about a structural conversation. Okay, so let's go through from like 1 to 10. That's actually easier. It's more about brainstorming and building on top of each other's idea and generate something new as a group, which requires live interactions and iterations among the group, which is really hard to do online, right? Already. And I think in the hybrid world, that continues to be a big challenge. And we invested in this company called Mural, Mural, which provides online workspace where people can contribute ideas easily and people can move those ideas forward, just adding on to each person's input. Because if you think about just Google Doc, for example, it's really hard to quote unquote mess up what other people wrote because it's a little tricky, right? It looks so similar to the final product that people want to respect what others contributed. And there's a long chain of comments on the right-hand side. And it's just, I can't see everything anymore. So there's a limitation to that paradigm. Like, okay, so this is paper, right? The physical paper, and it's converted online. That's Google Doc and other documentation apps. We need something else. And we think that, for example, Mural, Mural, is one good answer to that, which is very important for companies to get the best out of the employees' intention and efforts and collaboration. So in the hybrid world, what would be needed is what I'm thinking constantly.
Tsune, what do you know you need to get better at?
Time management. Too many things to read, do, and it's a constant challenge.
And finally, Tsune, what's the best way for listeners to connect with you and follow along with Will?
Yeah, my email is first name at wilab.com, wilab.com. And I read every email that comes in. And we have the Twitter and social presence. So we try to broadcast what we're doing and what our portfolio companies are doing. So it'd be great if anyone is interested, follow our social channels like Twitter, Facebook, and all that.
Awesome. Well, we've got one portfolio company that's had a ton of inbound customer interest from Japan. Looking forward to talking to you about that offline and finding one to work on together.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to it. And thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tsune. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that'll wrap up today's interview. If you enjoyed the episode or a previous one, let the guest know about it. Share your thoughts on social or shoot them an email. Let them know what particularly resonated with you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that some of the smartest folks in venture are willing to take the time and share their insights with us. If you feel the same, a compliment goes a long way. Okay, that's a wrap for today. Until next time, remember to over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks so much for listening.